Monk's Mound, foundational and formative evidence. Monk's Mound has been called a pyramid, a temple platform, a burial monument, an elite residence, council place, a cosmographic center, an urban capital, and an engineered earthwork. Every one of those descriptions is anchored in something real in the record. Not one of them is adequate as a whole. This film is not an attempt to choose the winner. It is a history of how the answers changed and of what changed them. The 5 questions are the ordinary ones. Who built it? What is it? When was it made? Where does it sit? Why was it made? The claim of this film is that those questions did not simply get better answers. The questions themselves were rebuilt, one inch at a time, by mapping, by excavation, by radiocarbon, by archaeomagnetism, by regional comparison, by Bayesian modeling, and by native-centered interpretation. The source base includes something new. In July of 2026, Richard Yerkes, professor of anthropology at Ohio State University and research associate at the Field Museum, answered 4 specific questions put to him about this record. His replies are integrated throughout. Where he corrected me, I say so. Before we look at any evidence, one rule: this film uses 2 words carefully, and it will use them constantly. Foundational means a piece of evidence central to the interpretation, to testing, or to preservation. It is the designation of importance. It is not a designation of proof. A foundational hypothesis is one that has to be taken seriously and has to be tested. It is not one that has already been demonstrated. Formative is used in its ordinary developmental sense. Evidence that comes before or helps shape Cahokia's Mississippian fluorescence. It is not being introduced as the new formal archaeological phase, and nothing in this film should be read as proposing one. Foundational and formative describe evidentiary role. Proven, strong, supported, unresolved, and contradicted describe the evidentiary status. Those 2 vocabularies do different work. Confusing them is the most common way this material gets misreported. A thing can be foundational and unresolved at the same time. Feature 1 is, Feature 50A is. Holding both those truths at once is the discipline of this entire exercise. The first discipline, scale. The first discipline is scale. There are 3 scales here, and they are constantly collapsed into one another. The first is the American bottom as a region. The second is the Cahokia precinct. The third is the specific deposit inside Monk's Mound. Yerkes compiled 32 late archaic radiocarbon determinations from excavated American bottom contexts. 5 of those 32 were run on deposits at the Cahokia site itself, in the Cahokia Interpretive Center tract, also called the Museum Tract. They range from 4,570 radiocarbon years before present down to about 2,150, with a cluster between them. This is the earliest directly deposited evidence from Cahokia site carried anywhere in the work. The late archaic occupation inside the Cahokia precinct is not inferred. It is dated, and it does not date Monk's Mound. That sentence is the entire point of separating the scales. Deep regional occupation supplies the social ceremonial background from which the monument emerged. It supplies context. It cannot be transferred automatically onto a deposit inside the mound. A regional date, a featured date, and a date on one object are different claims. They require different evidence. The mound as architecture and archive. Monk's Mound is not a pile of interchangeable dirt. The Corps' N 2005 and 2007 profiles exposed discrete basket loads, broadcast fill, clay-rich faces, prepared and burned surfaces, burned clay intrusions, structural elements, erosion scars, slumps, ancient additions, and modern repairs. The front ramp was finished with color-selected red, yellow, and brown clays. Burned daub and charcoal, in particular, basket loads show that some fill sources contain debris from structures or occupation areas. The plant record is just as specific. It includes wetland taxa with borrow from low-lying ground, annual weeds sealed before prolonged colonization, maize and other food remains, and wood from several habitat zones. The interior is therefore an archive of labor organization and material selection, not simply a mass supporting a summit. That changes what an early object inside the mound can mean. An early artifact can be residual, carried in later fill from another older deposit. The same dirt can contain an older object, but an articulated burial cannot be carried intact inside a basket load. Articulation is the test. It means the animal was buried where it was found. Equally, a younger post can cut deeply into an older deposit, and a cap can record closure or renewal rather than first construction, which is why the rule is simple. Follow the feature boundary and the provenance. Elevation alone is not age. Feature 50A, the dog burial. Feature 50A is an articulated small dog burial on Reed's third terrace, the terrace often called the fourth in older notes. Reed places the pit past the final structure post row. The animal was recorded with about 50 grams of red ochre and a small plain vessel cataloged MS 38/145. Schilling reports that 2 completed essays on the dog bone returned 2 outcomes, one late Archaic or early woodland date, and one middle woodland. The third laboratory found too little carbon in another portion for accurate dating. Those 2 completed outcomes disagree at phase precision. They converge on a broader and more consequential proposition. Sampled bone is pre-Mississippian. Here's why that matters. The burial lies high in the upper monument. The principal mound mass beneath the burial necessarily predates the animal. It is a claim that one directly sampled primary articulated deposit high in the monument returned 2 reported pre-Mississippian outcomes, and no responsible chronology can simply set that aside. Reed's published wording groups the post pits and the dog burial on a common 5-degree alignment and says that many members of the group cut earlier major structures and palisade features. Overlying cap is roughly 70 centimeters thick. Wilson's sized material dates a later sealing and resurfacing episode. The burial predates that cap. The cap says nothing by itself about the age of the principal mound mass beneath the burial. Yerkes was asked directly whether a determination is still obtainable. His answer was specific. He did not know whether a suitable dog bone or directly associated organic samples survive at the Illinois State Museum. If they do, they should be assessed and submitted for dating and analyzed in an explicit Bayesian sequence. He also corrected a reading of Parmalee's comparison that the animal falls within the measured of Hagg's archaic shell-heap dogs is a statement about the size of the dog, not its cultural affiliation. At that time, a large number of late archaic dog burials had been described, which may simply be what supplied the comparison set. The dog did not become an archaic animal because of its morphology. Morphology is a zoological context. It is not a name. On August 8th, 2007, during the East Slope stabilization cut, an upright post roughly 30 centimeters in diameter was exposed in association with limestone slabs at an elevation near 143.7 meters above sea level. In the field, the first identification was cedar. The laboratory identification was taxodium, bald cypress. The tree may have been about 125 years old when it felled. It carries an old wood caveat into any date run on it. The limestone concentration included slabs of various sizes. One was roughly 1.5 feet long, 8 inches wide, and 2 inches thick. A Madison County shale paste cord-marked shard and a catfish spine were associated with the feature sample. Work stopped locally. The feature was photographed, mapped, covered, and left in place. What exactly does that establish? The limestone is proven. The upright bald cedar post is proven. Their association is proven. The local stop, documentation, covering, and reburial are proven. The word structure is already an interpretation because the complete plan was never exposed. What was visible may have been one portion of a larger post and floor arrangement. The full post pattern, floor plan, contents, construction stage, and use episode remain unknown. Timothy Pocketot, who was present when Feature 1 was exposed, read it as in the field as a possible charnel house. Mark Essery read it as a small building foundation, or the end of a log-roofed building. Those are not frivolous readings, and the charnel reading is not mine. Pocketot later established a monk's mound, stone floor, and upright post-mortuary comparison. Reed independently compared the east slope limestone pavement and post to a regional charnel house example, and there is a documented regional class of the comparison. The East St. Louis stone quarry structure, the River Estate structure, the Kane mortuary complex, and a wider American bottom mortuary architecture. So the hypothesis is archaeologically grounded, and it is foundational in the exact sense defined at the start. It is central to interpretation, to what information may be present, and to whether the 2007 response was adequate, to whether the consultation was owed, and how any future non destructive testing should be designed. Yerkes was asked whether the charnel reading is reasonable and whether anything stronger could be said between the two readings. His answer sets the boundary. Without excavation or detailed geophysics remote sensing, the precise function of the exposed limestone and post feature cannot be determined. Charnel houses are documented in ethnographies and in archaeological investigations in and around Cahokia. The interpretation is plausible. It has not been demonstrated. The formation now governs every reference in the work. A proven, constructed feature, a foundational charnel house hypothesis, precise function unresolved. One consequence is administrative rather than archaeological. The plausible mortuary interpretation was raised at the moment of exposure and was never tested. The absence in the released work of a feature specific mortuary determination, notification, treatment, authorization, or curation and disposition chain remains material. Local stopping, documentation, covering, and reburial were responsible immediate actions. They were not a complete mortuary determination. The Yerkes correction, no clean regional split. The first question I put to Yerkes is one on which I was most wrong. I had proposed a clean split. The southeastern submound public or council architecture on one side, paired lodges between Garden Creek Mound number 1 and a single lodge beneath Town Creek and the Ohio Valley submound mortuary architecture on the other. Yerkes rejected it, and his reasoning is now carried here in full. Structures found beneath Adena, Hopewell, Middle Mississippian mounds, and the mounds themselves had many different forms and functions. Generalizations about association between mounds and structures beneath them are not warranted. Mounds were not always built directly over abandoned structures. Some Adena mounds overlap outlines of paired post structures. Not all post circles were covered by mounds, and not all earthen enclosures had mounds inside them. Activities in those ritual spaces were not only mortuary. Robert Hall described Hopewell ritual as including fertility, world renewal, adoption, succession, and mourning. Andrew Fortier suggested that Hopewell earthworks also served as rendezvous centers where feasting, dancing, visiting, and ritual took place. The Mississippians also built structures, and some of those were found beneath mounds, but not all of them were council houses. At Cahokia, Yerkes supplies the decisive control. The locations of mounds in the central elite area, inside the stockade with bastions, followed a master plan and grid. The mounds were not necessarily built to close the cycle of constructing, abandoning, or burying the building. Mound 51 was built over a borrow pit that had first been filled rapidly before the mound was constructed. Mound locations were planned and were not necessarily associated with structures found beneath them. Elite residences, charnel houses, and temples could be built on mound terraces and summits. Yerkes' instruction was direct. Remove any attempt to establish a split between the function of structures beneath mounds in the Ohio Valley and the Southeast, and that correction has now been made. Mound 51 is a negative control on the universal structural succession. Garden Creek remains a positive, site-specific case for paired submound lodges. Both are evidence, and neither is a universal rule. Who built it? Before professional archaeology, Public descriptions spoke of an unnamed class of people or an unnamed race. That language separated the monument from living native nations and left identity open to speculation. Promotional and diffusionist narratives moved in to fill the gap. From the 1920s through the 1950s, excavation and ceramic classification placed Cahokia within indigenous eastern woodlands and Mississippian archaeology. Artifacts, houses, burials, and regional sequences began to replace the generic lost race idea. From the 1960s through the 1980s, large-scale salvage archaeology and phase system produced a more specific population history, framed as the work of an organized Mississippian polity. From the 1990s forward, research increasingly emphasized a native urban community formed through migration, alliance, ritual authority, and changing institutions. The current bounded answer is Monk's Mound was built and repeatedly used by indigenous communities of Greater Cahokia. The evidence does not justify assigning the complete construction history to one present day nation, one language, or one social group. Archaeology phases describe material patterns and sequences. They do not, by themselves, name an ethnicity. So the record distinguishes builders, later summit users, Cahokia Illini community of the River L'Aube area, French missionaries and traders, 19th century owners, and modern managers. Those are separate occupation and management layers. The later ones must not be back projected onto the first. Native ceremonial comparison adds depth without converting analogy into ownership. Osage and Dahican time depth evidence, House of Mystery traditions, Muskogee Square grounds, and related descendant community knowledge showed that the ceremonial institutions with deep regional histories survived into documented times. They restore native intellectual and ceremonial context to a monument long interpreted through external typologies. The proper conclusion is continuity of themes and institutions worthy of consultation. It is not exclusive attribution by resemblance alone. What is it? In the 19th and early 20th century, Monk's Mound was framed mainly as a giant pyramid or a temple mound, defined by exterior size and compared with Old World monuments. That framing dominated because so little interior evidence was available. By the mid 20th century, it was understood as a four-terrace platform mound supporting major summit structures classified within Mississippian ceremonial architecture. Excavation, coring, pottery, and post pattern shifted attention from the outline to the construction and use. From the 1960s through the 1990s, it became a staged earthen monument and the central feature of a planned city connected with elite residence, temple, council, and ideological authority. Now it is also an informative, rich archive of basket loaded soils, prepared surfaces, structures, repairs, failures, colors, selected clays, biological remains, burials, and later reoccupation. Its summit and terraces are plural in the same way. Reed documented a major structure, later post groups, a central post, dog burial, offerings, capping, and repeated alterations. Feature 1 adds a constructed intramound feature of unresolved function. The first terrace later carried the River L'Aube Chapel, a Cahokia Illini dwelling, pits, cemetery, and trade assemblage. So the question, what is Monk's Mound, has a different answer at different elevations and dates. What it is not is equally worth stating. It is not adequately described as a historic building. It is not an empty mass of sterile dirt. It is not a universal council house mound, a universal burial mound, or a single phase temple platform. The present working definition is this: Monk's Mound is a monumental native earthen complex whose present form resulted from stage construction, summit and terrace use, closure and resurfacing, structural intrusion, repair, failure, and post contact use. Its mound fabric is both architecture and archive. It had been erected by hand more than 2,000 years earlier. It proves an older estimate circulated, not how it was obtained. Now comes Yerkes' crucial correction. I had described the 1971 conference as mainly formalizing phase names after the chronology had already moved. Yerkes said that was too weak. At the conference, ceramics were used to define new cultural phases that replaced the old village focus and Trappist focus system in use since 1952. Fowler and Hall summarized the results in 1972 in Archaeological Phases at Cahokia, later reprinted in 1975. The new chronology extended from AD 600 to 1800, the late woodland through the historic period. In 1972, the year after the conference, Yerkes was a student at the Logan Museum in Beloit College Summer Field School in Archaeology. The new chronology was already in use. It is the replacement of one classification framework with another working system built from ceramics. And the system did not stop changing there. A massive FAI 270 archaeological project began in the late 1970s. Its excavators across the northern and southern Apodum produced a broader revision of the late Archaic through the historic period. The chronology grew because the excavated sample grew. For the Mississippian urban sequence at Cahokia, many researchers now use a five-phase shorthand. Emergent Mississippian 8925 to 1050, Lowman 1050 to 1100, Sterling 1100 to 1200, Moorhead 1200 to 1275, and Sand Prairie 1275 to 1350. In Yerkes' account, the last four phases came from that conference revision. Cahokia is commonly thought to have reached peak size about AD 1200, declined through Moorhead and Sand Prairie phase, and been abandoned by 1450. Those are useful historical coordinates. They are not magic walls around every deposit. A phase originates material patterns. It does not physically date the past, a burial, a sod block, or the bottom of the mound. The laboratory result does not change because the community redraws a phase boundary, and a public brochure cannot substitute a measured sample. That is why chronology must be divided by scale. The American bottom contains a deep record of human occupation. Yerkes compiled 32 late Archaic radiocarbon determinations from excavated contexts, 4 non-anomalous determinations from Cahokia site itself, and the interpretive center or museum tract range from 4,570 plus or minus 210 radiocarbon years before present to about 3,110 plus or minus 80. That is direct evidence of late Archaic occupation inside the Cahokia precinct. It does not itself date Monk's Mound. The city, the mound, and the feature inside the mound are three different chronological objects. Confusing them creates certainty where none exists. Inside Monk's Mound, different events carry different clocks. Pre-conference coring supplied evidence discussed around the time of the ceramic conference. Summit posts have Wisconsin radiocarbon determinations. First Terrace carries 5 archaeomagnetic determinations about AD 1120 to 1230. Archaeomagnetism describes a physical signal in fired earth. It is not sensitive to ceramic opinion. Sod blocks, drainage layers, summit structures, caps, repairs, and historic occupations each belong to their own context. Then there is feature 50A. High in the third terrace lies an articulated small dog buried in a pit with approximately 50 grams of red ochre and reported small plain vessel. 2 period outcomes were reported from the dog bone, one late Archaic and early woodland, another middle woodland. A later audit shows that these 2 representations were one sample, not 2 independent samples. A separate portion failed because it contained too little carbon. The numerical ages, uncertainties, laboratory identifiers, pre-treatment, collagen, isotope, and calibration data remain unpublished. The result is neither ignore it nor the entire mound is proven archaic. The direct assay chronology remains open. Yerkes supplied the research path. He did not know whether the suitable dog bone or directly associated organic material still survived at the Illinois State Museum. If it does, he said, submit it for dating and undertake a Bayesian analysis of the dates. He's also corrected the use of Paul Parlamy's comparison. The dog's similarity to archaic shell heap dogs concerns the body size. Size is zoological context, not date nor cultural affiliation. That separates the burial context, morphology, and assay history. The articulated burial remains significant. The measurements supply comparison, and the date must come from an auditable evidence tied to provenance and stratigraphy. So when was Monk's Mound made? There is no honest one-line date. There is deep indigenous landscape, a Mississippian urban sequence, a principal mound mass, and transformed through multiple events, summit structures, terrace additions, burials, caps, repairs, French and Illini occupation of the first terrace, and modern stabilization. The New York's answer tells us what the conference changed and what it could never change. The conference rebuilt the chronological language. It did not alter the carbon of a bone, the thermal remnant signal from buried earth, or the position of a feature inside the mound. Where? 4 different locations in one question. Where is Monk's Mound? The simple answer is near the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois confluence, at Cahokia near present-day Collinsville. The archaeological answer has 4 layers. First, where's the city? Monk's Mound stands within a planned precinct of plazas, palisades, neighborhoods, and smaller mounds. Yerkes emphasizes that the central mound field followed a master grid and plan. Mound locations cannot be explained by a universal rule that every mound buried the structure beneath it. Mound 51 is the warning. It was built over a borrow pit that the first had to be filled rapidly. Second, where in the mound? Feature 50A lies high in the third terrace. Feature 1 lies within the east slope about 243 meters high. The deep stone mass lies on the west side. The River Laab Chapel, the Cahokia Illini dwelling, pits, cemetery, and trade assemblage belong to the first terrace. On a flat map, those points look close. Stratigraphically and historically, they are worlds apart. A flat map cannot resolve elevation, intrusion, or sequence. Third, where in the regional landscape? Cahokia stood between floodplain, prairie, and woodland, on routes moving stone, shell, copper, food, people, and ideas. Regional comparisons are necessary, but Yerkes adds the control. Resemblance did not establish identical function. A charnel house, council building, temple, residence, enclosure, post circle, and mound can share elements without being the same institution. Fourth, where in the history of claims? A railway advertisement, 1970 brochure, 1971 conference, 1972 field school, a 2007 cut, and a 2026 expert email occupy different places in the evidence chain. They are not observations of the same kind. The correct model is a 3-dimensional and event-specific, where in the city, where in the mound, where in the regional landscape, and where in the history of interpretation. Why? The purpose is episodic, plural, and still present. Why was Monk's Mound built? Early writers saw a religious pyramid and inferred one sacred purpose from size. Later accounts emphasized chiefs, temples, councils, residences, political authority, cosmology, and urban integration. Each may describe an episode. None should control the whole history. This is where Yerkes' first correction is as important as his fourth. Mortuary features beneath mounds in the Ohio Valley, council architecture beneath mounds in the southeast. Yerkes rejected it. Adena, Hopewell, Middle Mississippian mounds and structures had many forms and functions. Not every abandoned building was covered by a mound. Not every post was mounded. Not every contained a mound. Hopewell's ceremonial life included mourning, but also fertility, world renewal, adoption, succession, gathering, feasting, dancing, visiting, and rendezvous. Middle Mississippian mounds could include council spaces, residences, temples, and charnel houses. At Cahokia, the city plan could determine a mound location independently of what stood beneath it. The correction does not empty the mound of meaning. It prevents form from being mistaken for a verdict. Meaning is not erased by multiplicity. It becomes tied to the actual episodes. The evidence still supports purposeful episodes. The colored front ramp created a formal approach. Summit buildings may have served political, residential, ceremonial, and mortuary activity. Dog deposits near openings may concern offerings, thresholds, protection, or companionship. Caps may mark closure or renewal. Repairs may have been technical acts and ceremonial obligations together. Native creation traditions from several eastern woodland people describe the earth rise from primordial water. Monk's Mound was built from non-local soils, including wetland-associated sediments and deliberately selected colors. That comparison can offer an earth diver interpretive frame. The strongest answer to why is episodic. Ask why the ramp was resurfaced, why the building was raised, why the dog was buried, why the cap was sealed an earlier surface, why the terrace enlarged, why the slope failed and was repaired. Do not demand that one purpose explain more than 1,000 years of construction, use, memory, and reoccupation. There is also a modern why. Why preserve the mound as intact fabric? Because every exposure has shown that even plain soil contains sequence, plants, artifacts, posts, stone, surfaces, burning, and datable context. Preservation protects the archive so that better questions can be answered later with less destructive methods and fuller descendant community participation. In closing, the monument did not change, the questions did. Yerkes' new information gives the evidence sharper edges. The Ohio Valley and Southeast did not neatly divide into mortuary and council worlds. Feature 1 may be a charnel house, but plausibility is not demonstration. Feature 58 dog may still be testable, but body size is not chronology. And one sample measured twice is not independent replication. The 1971 conference did not invent a 1,000-year estimate, but it genuinely replaced an outdated archaeological framework. Who? Indigenous communities of Greater Cahokia. What? A monumental earthen complex whose fabric has both architecture and archive. When? Not one date, but a sequence of occupations, construction episodes, burials, buildings, caps, repairs, and reuse. Where? At the center of a city, inside the continental crossroads, within a three-dimensional record. Why? For the purposes of plural, episodic, political, ceremonial, social, mortuary, practical, and still not fully recovered. An expert correction is the monument is an investigation and becomes accountable to evidence. Monk's Mound did not change when Yerkes answered, the questions did. Non-spoken source and evidence control note. Yerkes regional function correction. The Ohio Valley Southeast split is removed. Mound, enclosures, post circles, the great houses and summit buildings and subbound structures had varied forms and functions. Cahokia's central mound locations also followed a master plan. Mound 51 is the negative control of a universal building enclosure sequence. Feature 1 boundary. The limestone and bald cypress feature is physically documented. A charnel house interpretation is plausible but not yet demonstrated. Excavation or detailed geophysical remote sensing would be required to determine the precise function. Feature 50A route. If suitable curated dog bone and directly associated organic material survives at the Illinois State University, then Yerkes recommended dating and Bayesian analysis. Parmalee's comparison is treated as body size comparison, not chronological or cultural affiliation. 1971 cultural connection. The Cahokia Ceramic Conference replaced the Old Village focus and Trappist focus with a framework that had a working cultural phase chronology. Fowler and Hall summarized it in 1972. Yerkes reports it was in use in 1972 at the Beloit Logan Museum's Field School. FAI 270 later revised and expanded that regional sequence. pre-ceramic and assay controls. The Illinois Park brochure from stating AD 900 to 1150 public estimate predates the conference. The Figure 50A period outcomes came from one sample measured twice and separate insufficient carbon attempt. The numerical and laboratory quality control file still remains unpublished. Scale rule. Late archaic occupation within the Cahokia precinct does not by itself date Monk's Mound. City chronology, mound construction, terrace additions, and individual features remain separate chronological objects. Principal source set, Yerkes. Email correspondence, July 2026. Fowler and Hall, Archaeological Phases at Cahokia from 1972. Monk's Mound 2007 Stabilization Analysis. Monk's Mound Foundational Informative Analysis.